Hey everyone, it's David here from ShareFaithkids. I want to welcome you to our YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about 3 ways that you can serve your children's ministry team. Be sure and stick around to the end of this video because we're going to have some great resources for you that you can use however and whenever you want in your ministry. So, a little context on this discussion. I just got back from Houston, Texas, where I attended the Empower Conference. This was an amazing conference. I got to meet so many great ministry leaders and volunteers and hear about amazing stuff that God is doing throughout the world. At that conference, I had the opportunity to teach a class on how to grow your kids' ministry by doing less. And in that class, we talked about a lot of big picture stuff, things like vision, team building, and strategy. And it seemed like for those who attended, the highlight was when we talked about how to serve your ministry team. So that's what I wanted to do in this video. Just give you an overview of that discussion. And then again, at the end of this video, share with you some of the resources that you can use in your ministry. Now, anyone who has served in kids ministry knows how important volunteers are. There is so much going on in children's ministry, so many administrative tasks from check-in to greeters to the worship teams to small group that volunteers are required to do it well. But that can cause a bit of a dysfunction in our kids ministry because volunteers can pick up real quick if you see them as a person and you're genuinely investing in them as a person, or if you just see them as a means to an end. So when I discussed what it takes to serve our volunteers, I opened with this question. Does your team exist to serve you, or do you exist to serve your team? The answer seems obvious, right? Like I should exist as a ministry leader to serve my team, but the administrative burden of children's ministry can really skew that fast. There's so many things that need to get done that really, really easily we can start going, oh, they'd make a great worship leader. They'd make a great kids check-in person. They would do great in our small group. We bring them in, we plug them in a role, and then that's it. We don't really invest in them anymore. And if we take that approach that our team exists to serve us, that's how we lay the foundation of burnout for our volunteers. They start to check out. They start to realize there's not much there beyond just them fulfilling a role or doing a task. And that's not where we want to be. Where we want to be as ministry leaders is serving our team. That's why God has equipped us and positioned us in that role. So in this video, I'm going to talk about 3 ways that you can serve your ministry team. Okay, first up, know your team. This seems obvious, who's on your team, but as we go through these points, you'll see it's not just as simple as, I've met them and plugged them in a role. First, I would say when it comes to knowing your team, who are they? First off, know their names. So in some of the bigger ministries, I served in a church with over 100 kids ministry volunteers. And there were times I had no idea who was serving, right? I met them once, but their name, it was gone. And so I would say you start by knowing each and every one of your ministry volunteers' names. But beyond that, know their families, know their stories. You want to know your volunteers as people. So one of the ways that I used to do that in my kids ministry is that I would go around with a clipboard and it would have all of the people who were serving, where they were serving, and I would go around and ask each one of them some questions. What did you do last weekend? What are you doing this weekend? What's going on with your kids? And I would just write down little notes. And for me, it would help the conversation of getting to know them progress forward each week. It was great to be able to come into a classroom and go, hey, you mentioned that Billy was going off to college next week. How was his first week in college? What challenges are you facing? Is there anything that we can be praying for? And when your volunteers hear that, when they hear that you actually care about them and their families and what they're going through, that goes a long way. Along with that, it always surprised me, and it shouldn't, but it did, as I would make my rounds through the classrooms. Some of the volunteers would share things like, yeah, my husband just went in for chemotherapy treatment, or my aunt is in the hospital right now. She was in a bad accident. And I don't care whatever else is going on in kids ministry, when a volunteer shares something like that, that's when everything else needs to stop and you need to invest in that volunteer. Let them know that what's going on truly matters to you. Take time to pray for them and really communicate. They're more than just someone filling a role to get you through the weekend service. They are a person who matters. So, knowing your team, first, know who they are. Second, what are their challenges? We just hit on this a little bit, but know what's going on in their life physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Sometimes your volunteers are going through a season in life where things are difficult and maybe they're questioning their faith or they're questioning God's love for them. You need to, as a leader, to know that that's going on in their life and be able to speak words of hope and comfort and life into them. Let them know that their struggles matter to you, that you take that seriously, and that you are willing to invest in them. And finally, know what their passions in life are. Beyond just ministry, what are their giftings? What are their personal goals? What is going on in their career? As a ministry leader, one of the unique opportunities that you bring to the table is networking. You know a lot of things that are going on in the church. And so if you have a volunteer that's come in, maybe a younger volunteer, and they have a desire or a dream to be a graphic designer, odds are you know someone in the church who already is a graphic designer. And the ability for you to hear that passion in one of your volunteers and then connect them to someone in the church who is already doing that career and has been successful in it, that goes so far and can mean so much to your volunteers. So as you're making your rounds, know who they are, know their challenges, know their passions, and always be looking for ways to invest in your team. So first off, know your team. The next way that you can serve your team is through equipping your team. Now, sometimes when we think about equipping, we look at things like resources or different packets or informations that we can give. But you got to take some steps back when we look at equipping. The first thing that I would talk about is interviewing. You need to take steps to make sure that you bring someone onto your team well. Make sure that they are brought in with a good understanding of why they're serving in kids ministry, what their role and responsibilities are going to be. This is actually one of I can't think of the words. One of the resources that we're going to be providing for you is a kids church interview outline. When we would bring someone new onto our team, we'd always have a series of questions that we would ask them. And I'll share a few of them for you. The first one we would always ask is, why are you interested in volunteering on our kids ministry team? Now, this one seems obvious, but it did a great job of separating the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. When you ask that question, you hear very clearly what someone's heart and motives are. Now, some people will say, I've raised 3 or 4 kids of my own. I love children. I just love being around them, and I want to find a way to invest in our kids. And you should go, yep, you're on the team. This is what we're looking for. I remember one circumstance where I had a mom and her teenage son come in, and I asked the teenager, hey, why do you want to serve with our kids ministry? And he didn't say a whole lot. And I kept probing and asking, and I wasn't getting anything. And so I asked Mom, well, why do you think he wants to sign up? And she said, well, we've been having a lot of trouble with him at home, and there's been some defiance, and he's missed curfew. And so we thought if we signed him up for kids ministry, that would teach him some responsibility and that he might be better behaved at home. And so I kind of asked the question, so you're signing him up for kids ministry as a form of discipline? And it got quiet in the interview, I'm not gonna lie. But that's not why you want to bring someone in, right? You don't want them in kids ministry because they feel burdened or obligated to. You want someone there because they want to serve. Another question that we would ask is, how did you briefly share how you came to your faith in Christ? And this would do a great job of fleshing out someone's spiritual maturity, where they were at in their walk with the Lord. And that is so important when you have someone around kids. Kids are in that formative stage of discovering who Jesus is and learning how to walk their faith out. And so you want people around your kids that love Jesus, and who hopefully have some spiritual maturity there where they know how to lead kids as they are growing in their relationship with Jesus. Another time, and this is a great question, another example that we would, or another question that we would ask is, what is an example of a time where you dealt with kids who were misbehaving or defiant? Classroom management is always going to come up with your kids' ministry volunteers. And so this question got to the heart of, how do you handle discipline? How do you handle kids? How do you handle things when the classroom gets difficult or things aren't going according to plan? And if we heard in that question, well, I just get really stern with them. I raise my voice and I put them in timeout and I leave them there until that gets dealt with. That would be a red flag for us, right? Discipline is important and classroom management is important, but really we always want, even with our discipline, there to always be a heart of love and grace guiding that conversation. What we would love to hear in that conversation is, I've raised children, I've made some mistakes in discipline, and here's some of the things I've learned. I always want my kids to know that they are loved. I never want the discipline to communicate, anger. As much as possible, I wanted to make sure that discipline never had a physical component to it. I wanted to try to communicate through my words and express the reason why certain behaviors weren't working and the reason why these activities were harmful, not only to the child themselves, but in our classroom as a whole. That kind of attitude, we would go, yes, that's what we need to hear, and that's what we need to be evaluating. In this document, we've got a list of 7 other questions, a total of 10 that we would ask, and the reason we ask them. So be sure and stay tuned to the end of this video. We'll get you that resource. So equipping your team starts with interviewing. Next up is onboarding. One of the big mistakes that kids ministries make is they bring someone new onto the team, they find the volunteer, they go through that interview, and then they just release the volunteer into ministry, and they don't really give them any clear definition of what they're supposed to do or how they're supposed to do it. And that is incredibly challenging for a volunteer. If we've been serving in ministry or leading ministry for a while, we can forget what it's like to be new. We have a lot of questions. We have a lot of insecurities and anxieties. And so bringing someone new into kids ministry and then just releasing them without any direction, it's a recipe for disaster. You're going to go one of two ways. One, your volunteer is going to get lost and they're going to get confused and they're just going to start receding back, and you're going to slowly watch them fade out of your ministry. And kids ministries have really high turnover, and that's one of the reasons why they're not being given clear direction. So you'll either see them fade out because you haven't given them direction, or you'll watch them take charge and do whatever they think they should do. And this can be a real big issue where you start getting a bit of a conflict and a power struggle in leadership going on in your ministry, where your new volunteer goes, well, no one's told me how to do this, so I'm just going to start making up my own programs or my own rules and regulations in this classroom. And real quick, you can get a dysfunctional situation where you and part of your team are pulling in separate directions. So the way that you avoid this is by effectively onboarding or bringing someone new onto your team. There's 2 big parts of that. Define their role and define their responsibilities. Role is the big picture idea, and this should always tie into your kids' ministry vision. We have brought you into kids ministry for this purpose, to fulfill this role. And so that might be, we brought you on as a small group leader. And in our church, one of our key values is creating a space where kids can feel welcomed and where they can have an open and honest discussion about Jesus, learning about him, growing in their faith, and asking questions. And that's what a small group leader does. You manage an environment where kids can grow in their faith. So that is your role. Now, your responsibilities are more specific. We want you there 15 minutes early so that we can discuss today's sermon and pray over the lesson. We want you to use this handout that we've created to step by step lead your group through a small group discussion. We want you available for prayer. And here are some tips on how you can lead children in prayer. And finally, we want you to be building relationships with parents. So anything that comes up in that small group discussion that you think a parent should know, we want you to reach out and connect with them. And here's some guidelines and some steps that you can take to connect with parents. So bringing someone on where you define their roles and define their responsibilities, it sets them up for success. And that's another one of our resources that we have here, a document where we've defined what a kids church small group leader is, but this document is going to be customizable and you can use it as a blueprint to define a lot of the roles and responsibilities that go on in your kids ministry. And finally, the way that you equip your team is through empowering them. And this is where we get more into the resource component. Kids ministry volunteers, your goal should be to lock them into serving kids and to remove as many other distractions from them as possible. And that's where things like curriculum and scheduling, classroom policies and training come into play. You don't want your kids ministry volunteers worrying about how to deal with an upset parent, worrying how to debug the check-in program that you're using, worrying about how they're going to find and access their curriculum. You want to set them up for success and provide them with resources that free them up to serve their team. And so one of the ways that you can do that is to just create an overview document of your kids' ministry, something that talks through what your core values are, what expectations of volunteers are, how you deal with safety issues, how you deal with angry parents, how you deal with discipline, clearly outlining those things so they're not a mystery and that your volunteers have access to those things whenever and wherever they need. And so that's the final resource that we've provided for you in this video is a kids church leader guideline document. And we've outlined the top things that a volunteer needs to know, from roles to responsibilities to issues of safety to issues of check-in to issues of discipline. There's a lot in there. And we've made that fully editable so you can go through there and go, love that. Nah, that's not going to work. Delete it. But you can tweak it and make it your own, right? So equipping your team is about interviewing, onboarding, and empowering. And finally, the final way that you can serve your team is through reviewing your team. It's real easy as a ministry leader to bring someone new into your children's ministry, to interview them, to onboard them well, and then to just kind of back off and let them do their thing. And a lot can happen as someone serves over a month or a quarter or a year. They can start encountering some struggles. They can find that maybe what they thought it was going to be isn't what it is. And so you need to consistently be engaging with your volunteers and reviewing them to make sure that things are on point, that the trajectory is still good. So there are 3 ways that I recommend reviewing your team. The first is with a pre-service meeting. If you can, get together half an hour early, 15 minutes early, and just have a discussion with your team. Now, I've been in a lot of those pre-service meetings, and what it can tend to be is the leader telling their team everything that's going on and what needs to happen. I would suggest the most important thing that you can do in those pre-service meetings is ask a question and then listen. Just hear what's going on. So maybe go, hey, last week we tried this new policy. I wanted to hear your guys' feedback. What did you see? Did you like it? Is it working? And as you listen, your team is going to share things that you had no idea were going on. You may have written a great policy, but in practice, in the classroom, it's not working very well. Your volunteers might be frustrated or upset. And so having that 15 minutes, those 30 minutes early to just hear what's going on with your team is so important and can go a long way to keeping in tune with your volunteers and making sure that they're set up for success. Second, quarterly meetings with your team. If you can do it monthly, great. If not, do meetings quarterly. Schedule them quarterly with your team. And one of the ways that you can set your volunteers up for success in those meetings is to have a clear agenda created in advance, printed out, and ready for everyone to follow. If possible, send out that agenda early. Let your volunteers know that we're only taking an hour of your time and we're not here just to waste your time, but we have a series of specific things that we want to talk about. And one big thing that should always be present in a quarterly meeting is you going back to the vision of your kids' ministry and reinforcing that vision with your team. It's easy for us who lead a ministry to forget what our vision statement is, right? We can share it and we can be precise with the words and we get it out there. But if we're not always going back to that vision statement and repeating it and reviewing it and sharing it, we can forget what it is. So if it's that easy for us to forget what a vision statement is, imagine your volunteers. Imagine how easy it can be for them to start having a disconnect between what they're doing and what you have said the vision of the church is. And so take advantage once a quarter to bring everyone together, remind them of the vision of your kids' ministry, and then tie that vision specifically to the things you are doing. If you've released a new initiative, maybe you've got a new check-in policy, go back to your vision statement. Remind your volunteers that your purpose is to create a safe and welcoming space where kids can be introduced to Jesus and loved by volunteers. That's just a vision statement off the top of my head, but let's say that's yours. Then you can take that vision statement and you can go to your new check-in policy and go, hey, we've launched this new policy and this new initiative. We know there's some new things going on and some challenges that you're facing, but we want to create a safe and welcoming place where we believe kids can be loved by volunteers and introduced to Jesus. And we think that with this new check-in policy, parents are going to have an easier time dropping their kids off. There's going to be less confusion. There's going to be less frustration. And end of the day, that's going to put our kids in a position where they can comfortably come into our room and learn about Jesus with as few distractions as possible. So, pre-service meetings, quarterly meetings, and then finally, one-on-one meetings. One of my biggest regrets looking back in kids ministry is how busy I was all the time. If anyone tried to stop me in the hallway, a volunteer, often I would put off the vibe or the attitude like, hey, I want to talk to you, but I got to go over here. There's just something so pressing and I'm so busy that I don't have time to talk to you because I got to go put out this fire. And while at the time I thought, well, this is good, it must mean that I'm doing my job because I've got a lot to do and I'm always moving here or there or doing something. What it caused to have happen was I never had time for the most important thing in my ministry, and that's my volunteers. And so as a ministry leader, you always need to make time for one-on-one interactions with your volunteer team. If you're so busy that you can't find time once a month to have a 5 to 10 to 15-minute conversation with one of your volunteers or with all of your volunteers spread out throughout that month, then something's going wrong. You've allowed the administrative burden or your schedule or your programming to rise to such a level where it's taking priority, and it shouldn't. Your volunteer team always should. So look for ways once a month that you can connect with each one of your volunteers. And I would say another thing that's good to practice is just walking slowly through kids ministry. And I know that might sound strange, but rather than hurrying and busying from one room to the next and putting out one fire after the next, if you're a leader, just walk slowly. And if someone interrupts you, be interruptible. Be present in such a way where you can stop, focus all of your attention on that volunteer, listen to what they're saying, give them your full attention, hear what's going on, speak something meaningful into their life, and then move on. And what you communicate to your volunteers when you do that is, I matter, right? You communicate that volunteer matters to you, that you're never too busy for your volunteers, and that you exist, not for them to serve you, as we said, but for you to serve them, right? And that's the heart and the attitude of Jesus. He said that he came not to serve or not to be served, but to serve. And as leaders in kids ministry, that's the same attitude we want to have. So, those are the three big ways that we can serve our team. We know our team, we equip our team, and we review our team. I hope you enjoyed this content. If there's some questions that you have or areas that you'd like me to discuss further, please be sure and leave comments in the comment section below. In the description, in the link below, I have provided for you links to all three of these documents, and I've provided them as Google documents that you can copy onto your own Google Drive. And what's great about that is as you copy them, they're going to clone my version, put them in your Google Drive, and then you can edit them so that they're specific to your ministry. And that's what any policy or any overview document needs to be. You can never just take someone else's and make it your own. It needs to be specific to your ministry, your context, and your team. So get those in the links in the description below. And finally, I'll end this video saying thank you. Kids ministry volunteers, leaders, you will never get enough credit for what you do. Kids ministry is the most important ministry in our churches. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for serving our kids. And I can't wait to talk to you again.